Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, there were two happy little children, a boy and a girl. Their names were Hansel and Gretel, and they lived in a cottage on the edge of a big dark wood. Hansel and Gretel often played in the wood because their father was a woodcutter, and sometimes, but not very often, he took his children with him when he set off for work. Hansel knew the names of most of the pretty birds that sang in the trees, and Gretel had her own special friends among the busy squirrels and the shy rabbit. Oh, how I wish that everything could stay the same forever and ever, Gretel would sometimes say. And Hansel would answer, "That's a silly kind of wish, little sister. Nothing stays exactly the same." Well, Hansel was right. One sad day, their mother became ill, and very shortly afterwards, she died. For a time, their father was too upset even to work. Then he met and married another woman and put all his sadness behind him. "Children," said he very gaily, "now you have a new mother who will love you and take care of you just as if she was your proper mother." The woodcutter was wrong in thinking that he had chosen a kind, motherly woman as his new wife. She was not kind and she was not motherly, and it became clear to the woodcutter that he had made a mistake in asking her to be his wife. Hansel and Gretel did their best to make their stepmother love them, but nothing they said or did pleased her. To make matters worse, the woodcutter suddenly found that he was using up all his savings to keep his family in food. He could no longer count on selling his logs for a good price. The people in the surrounding villages could no longer afford to buy his firewood. When the woodcutter's wife saw how poor they were becoming, she began to grudge spending what money they had left on food for the children. The woodcutter loved his children, and he was often very sad when he saw how hungry they were. But he was afraid of his wife and dared not say anything. Soon, his wife began to give Hansel and Gretel black looks whenever they sat down to eat. And one dreadful night, she said to her husband, "We must rid ourselves of these two children of yours. They have such huge appetites that soon there will be nothing left for us to eat." The woodcutter buried his face in his hands when he heard his wife's cruel suggestion, and his wife, enraged, began to shout and scream at him. Her shouts roused the children, and they crept downstairs to listen. "Be as quiet as a mouse," Hansel whispered to his sister. "We must not let them know we're listening." They heard their father plead with his wife over and over again, but this only made her shout even more loudly. At last she cried, "We shall take them into the forest tomorrow and leave them there. They will never find their way home if we take them to a part where there are no familiar paths." When Hansel saw his poor father nod his head in agreement, he took his little sister's hand and together they crept back to bed. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I have already thought of a plan." Long before his father and stepmother were awake, Hansel crept down the stairs and out into the garden. He filled his pockets with round, shiny pebbles, as many as they would hold, and then very quietly he went back into the house and up the stairs to bed. Before the sun had properly risen, he heard his stepmother call, "Hansel, Gretel, get dressed at once and come downstairs. We are going to take you into the forest for a picnic." "Don't worry, little sister," Hansel said as Gretel began to cry. "I have a plan and I know it will work." Their stepmother greeted them with a sour smile when they appeared in the kitchen. "Hurry," she said. "Eat that slice of bread now and take another piece for your picnic." The children ate their bread quickly, whilst their father got out his big axe. Soon they were ready to set out, the woodcutter leading the way into the dark, deep forest. When they had walked for some little time, Hansel stopped and looked back. "Hurry, you lazy boy," said his stepmother over her shoulder. "I just want to see if our cat was on the cottage roof," said Hansel. As he spoke, he dropped one of his shiny white pebbles on the grass. His plan was working. So long as he could linger behind his stepmother, he could go on dropping his pebbles. Hansel had no idea how far they walked that day. When his father stopped at last, they were in a strange part of the forest and miles from home. "We have gone far enough," said the woodcutter with a sad, bitter smile. "Rest here, children, whilst your mother and I go farther into the forest to gather wood." "They will not come back for us," Gretel whispered fearfully. "Don't worry, little sister," Hansel said, taking her hand. "I have laid a trail of shiny white pebbles. The pebbles will show us the way home." Then the children ate their bread and shared some of it with two friendly squirrels. "We must wait for a time," Hansel said when they had eaten. "We must not arrive at our cottage before they do." And he laughed so cheerfully that Gretel laughed too. "How clever you are, Hansel," she smiled. "Now I'm sure we shall get home safely, and I'm no longer afraid." When it was beginning to grow dark, Hansel took his sister's hand and led her through the trees. "Look, can you see?" he cried. "How brightly the pebbles shine even in the dark. Soon the moon will be riding high in the sky, and then my pebbles will look like gleaming silver pennies." When the moon came out at last, it was easier than ever to find the pebbles, and in no time at all, it seemed to Hansel their cottage was in sight, and they were home. How wonderful to be home! What a warm, welcoming hug their father gave them, and how darkly did their stepmother scowl as she stared at them. But Hansel and Gretel cared nothing for her black looks. They were safely home, and that was all that mattered. All was peaceful in the little house for some weeks, and then one night, just as the children were going to sleep, they heard the harsh voice of their stepmother raging again at their father. "We must find out if she is trying to persuade him to lose us again in the forest," Hansel whispered to Gretel. "Come on, let's listen to what they're saying." So they crept to the top of the stairs, and they listened and they listened. And sad to say, they heard their father murmur, "Oh, very well, wife. We shall take them into the forest early in the morning. And this time, I promise you, they shall not find their way home." Hansel waited until his parents had gone to bed. Then he crept downstairs, expecting to find the back door unlocked. But this time the door was locked and barred, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not turn the big heavy key. "You must save your bread," he told Gretel in the morning as they were setting out. "I will lay a trail of breadcrumbs. The crumbs will show up just as well as the pebbles did." Gretel nodded her little head and promised that she would not eat her share of the bread, but give it to Hansel before they set out. How quickly their stepmother walked as she and the woodcutter pushed the children in front of them through the woods. But soon Hansel and Gretel were able to run ahead. And then Hansel was able to drop his breadcrumbs in secret places. This time, the woodcutter took his children a great long way into the forest to a quiet, dark, deserted place. "Rest here," he told them at last. "Your mother and I'll go a little farther on, and then we shall come back for you." And he kissed them tenderly. "He won't come back. I know he won't," Gretel cried. "It doesn't matter," Hansel said cheerfully. "I've laid a splendid trail of breadcrumbs. As soon as the moon appears in the sky, we shall set out for home. Let's try to sleep." When the children awoke, it was dark. Presently the moon came out, but oh dear, search as he might, Hansel could not find a single breadcrumb. The little birds had found the bread first and eaten up every bit of it. How dark and scary it was in that thick, gloomy wood, and how wildly did the children run, this way and that, and all the time, had they but known it, they were going farther and farther away from their own little cottage. At last, they were so tired that even Hansel was ready to give up. They had walked most of the night, and now it was morning again, and they were so weary and so hungry they thought they would surely die. And then, just when Gretel was ready to burst into tears, she saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting in a tree. "Look, Hansel," she whispered. "That pretty white bird seems to be trying to tell us something. How sweetly it sings! I think it wants us to follow it." As she spoke, the white bird spread its wings and flew just a little away, and Hansel and Gretel followed it. It led them to the most wonderful little house they had ever seen. "Goodness!" shouted Hansel. "It's a house made of bread and covered with cake and icing and sugary biscuits." Gretel clapped her hands and shrieked with delight, all her tiredness forgotten. "Clever bird!" she cried. "It has led us to this wonderful cake house. Ooh, I'm so hungry. Look, Hansel, the porch has pillars of gorgeous sticky rock. Isn't it tempting? Let's try the sugary cake walls first." As they began to help themselves to the cake house, the door opened suddenly, and out came a motherly old woman. She had a soft purring voice and bright red eyes, and she walked with a stick. "Come in, dear children," she said softly. "You like nibbling at my house, but wait until you see what I have for you inside. You can feast on sugared buns and apples and pears and delicious cakes all day long if you wish." "We're lost, and we'd love to come inside," said Hansel, his mouth full of cake. "Thank you very much." So the children went into the cake house, and soon they were seated at the table and eating all the nicest things imaginable. The old lady watched them with a kindly expression on her gnarled and wrinkled face. "Eat up, my dears," she would say, whenever Hansel or Gretel vowed they couldn't eat or drink anything more. "I like my children to be round and plump." And she would give the oddest little chuckle, as if she were sharing a secret joke with herself. "How lucky we are to have you," said Hansel at last. "May we stay here just for one night? Then tomorrow you will perhaps guide us to the path that will lead us out of this deep forest?" The old woman made no answer, but presently she showed Hansel and Gretel where they would sleep. And when they were safely tucked up in their beds, she watched over them until they had fallen sound asleep. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to cackle loudly, and as she hobbled about the room, chuckling and talking to herself, her red eyes blazed with greed and spite. The old woman, you see, was none other than the most wicked witch you can imagine, and her wonderful cake house was simply there to trap little children. Whenever she was hungry, she sent out her pet white bird to look for little boys and girls, just like Hansel and Gretel. How fortunate it was that her bird had performed so well, for it was a long time now she had managed to catch 2 such pleasant children. No wonder she smiled and chuckled as she prepared the cage into which she would put young Hansel in the morning. Poor Hansel! He could scarcely believe what was happening to him when the wicked witch carried him away early the next morning and thrust him into the small wooden cage. The horrid cage was anchored to the floor of the witch's tower with strong chains. "Let me out! Let me out!" Hansel screamed when he saw his sister. "I can't help you, brother," she replied. "We are in the power of a witch who eats little children. Now she has forced me to be her servant." Hansel shook the bars of his prison, but they were so thick and set so closely together that he soon gave up. He would never move them. "We must think of another way to save ourselves," he told Gretel. "Do whatever the old witch asks of you, and don't despair." It was hard to do everything the witch asked, because now she expected Gretel to do all the fetching and carrying, all the washing and sweeping of floors. "I'm far too busy cooking for that brother of yours," the witch would cackle. "He must have the best of everything, and all of it must be cooked with butter and cream. Oh ho! It won't be long before he is fat enough to roast and eat." Gretel had nothing but crab shells and stale crust to eat, for the witch had decided she would never make a tasty meal to enjoy. Every day for a week, the witch paid a visit to Hansel. Now, you may not know, but witches with very red eyes do not see very clearly. The wicked witch of the cake house had red eyes, and she did not see at all well, which was very lucky for Hansel. Each time the old woman went to the cage and said, "Hansel, let me feel if your finger grows fatter." Hansel thrust out a little chicken bone for her to feel. After 3 weeks, the wicked witch could not hide her disappointment from little Gretel. "That brother of yours eats like a lord," she said angrily, "and yet he grows no fatter. Ah, well, I shall eat him tomorrow. I cannot wait any longer for my feast." Then she sent Gretel into the yard to fetch water, and when she returned, told her to get out the largest dishes and biggest bowls, because she had a mind to make a tasty sauce and wished to have all the various ingredients ready mixed for tomorrow's dinner. How Gretel wept as she was forced to obey the wicked witch! How she pleaded and begged for mercy for her brother! But the witch only laughed and seemed very pleased at the sight of her tears. Early the next morning, the witch set about preparing for her feast. "I have a mind to bake first," she said to Gretel. "Light the fire, and I will heat up the oven." The witch began to bake, and as she kneaded the dough, she called out to Gretel to go to the oven, open the door, and see if it was heating up nicely. "The door is too big and heavy for me to open," said Gretel, "and I'm too small to look inside." "Stupid child," muttered the old witch. "I will look for myself." And she went over to the big oven in the wall and thrust her head inside. Silent as a mouse, Gretel crept up behind and with all her strength pushed the old witch deep inside her own oven. Then she shut and bolted the great iron door in the wall. So that was the end of the wicked red-eyed witch. Gretel quickly found the key to Hansel's prison and set him free. "The witch is dead," she told him excitedly, "and I know where she keeps all her treasure." Soon Hansel was filling his pockets with gold and precious stones taken from the witch's treasure chest, while Gretel waited by the door. Then they left that dreadful house and set out for home. They had walked for 2 hours or more when they came at last to a great wide lake. And at the sight of so much water, Gretel cried out in despair, "Oh, Hansel, what shall we do? We can't swim and there isn't a bridge or a boat anywhere inside." As she spoke, a lovely white swan came, swimming straight towards them. "Please take us across this wide, wide lake," Gretel said to the graceful white bird. And Hansel waded out into the water and climbed on its back. The swan opened its wings so that Hansel could sit safely, then took him across the lake before returning to ferry Gretel across. So, thanks to the bird, Hansel and Gretel were carried across the water, and to their surprise and delight, very soon spied their own little cottage through a gap in the trees. "Look, there's Father!" Gretel shouted in delight as the woodcutter appeared on the doorstep of the old cottage. With cries of joy, both children ran into his outstretched arms. Oh, what happiness to be hugged and kissed and drawn into the cozy kitchen where Hansel told his amazing story. When the woodcutter had heard it at least 3 times over and seen all the witch's treasure, he said, "Your stepmother left me. She did not love me after all." "We love you, Father," said Gretel, her eyes shining like stars. "And you love us," said Hansel. "You didn't want to leave us all alone in the dark forest, did you?" "Indeed not," said the woodcutter. "Then let us all be happy together," said Hansel, holding up a gleaming necklace of diamonds. "The witch's treasure will take care of all our wants forever and ever, and we will be able to help all our poor friends in the village whenever they need it." And so it proved. The end.